One of the most infamous things that the Jedi Order is criticized for is their tendency to exclusively induct infants or very young children into their order. Though the reason for this has been explained many times, there are those who believe that the Jedi should wait until the trainees are older and therefore can choose the life of a Jedi for themselves. However, this may seem reasonable, the Jedi staunchly believe that any child older than a toddler is too dangerous to be trained in the ways of the Force, with the Jedi High Council fighting back against the idea of even Anakin Skywalker, a 9-year-old, to be trained or considered to become a Jedi, deeming him too old to begin the training. This is one thing that the Sith, though, by contrast, do not adhere to, and actually do the opposite. Nearly every single powerful Sith Lord had something of a life prior to their induction into the Order, and very few exceptions were ever raised from birth or childhood into the Order of the Sith. The Sith emphasize the value of destroying one's old life whenever they accept the power and the role that the dark side has offered them. This is why they take new names, but would it not be easier to do this the Jedi's way? Wouldn't an impressionable young child be much easier to mold and craft into a powerful dark side servant? Well, the answer is no, and it would seem as though the Sith, by and large, actually despise this practice of the Jedi. So come with us today, my friends, as we open up yet another holocron and discover why the Sith don't raise their apprentices on their own. First glance, it would seem to only make sense to raise their own acolytes. The Jedi have done this for hundreds of years as they became more and more dogmatic and legalistic over the ages. But it was only a little over 1,000 years prior to the Clone Wars that Jedi were still accepting children below the age of 10. In the earlier years, Jedi inducted just about anyone into their order regardless of their age, but they would begin to limit these trainee ages to around the teenage years starting sometime after the old Sith Wars. Originally, this was because the Jedi wanted to have more time with their apprentices so that they could learn the basics of the Force before their adulthood. The younger and more spry Jedi weren't as effective since they were still learning the fundamentals. Very soon, the Jedi began to limit the age more and more, only accepting trainees that were children. This was because of all of the Sith Lords that was rising from their order. The Council attributed this to the Jedi having prior attachments before they joined the Jedi, and then the children not being able to understand the values of detachment, believing this to be a major contributor to why so many were falling to the dark side. By the era of the new Sith Wars, the Jedi refused to accept any trainees over the age of 7, a fact that the contemporary Dark Lords of the Sith criticized, and some of them even predicted that soon the Jedi would only accept infants. The Dark Lords of the Sith did their evolution somewhat in reverse. Back in the days of the old Sith Empire, they would obviously only recruit from within their own territories, but after the fall of this empire, they would be far more selective about those who they decided to train and impart with the gifts of the dark side. They would often take in teenagers and even adults. In all the subsequent rises of the Sith, apprentices were selected based on merit, power, or potential. This was in stark contrast to the Jedi, who would take in anybody that showed a modicum of Force sensitivity if they were an infant. The Sith, though, were far more fastidious when it came to their recruits. They looked exclusively for those that held exceptional power. Contrary to the Jedi, the Sith did not believe in strength of numbers, any Sith order that has always failed. Instead, they believe in the potency of the individual, and the individual's right to rule because of their strength alone. This is especially true concerning the Rule of Two era. Even Darth Bane himself was around 25 years old before he began his Sith training. There are of course a few exceptions, as Darth Tenebris is noted as one of the Sith that actually created their own apprentice, as Darth Tenebris created Plagueis by manipulating his friend and colleague, a Moon in the intergalactic banking clan, to marry another Moon woman, both of whom Tenebris knew had very high midichlorian counts. Both of them were Force sensitive, but Tenebris knew that if he were patient instead of settling, he could just take their child who would inherit the power of both of them. Despite this being a rousing success, Tenebris did not approach the soon-to-be Darth Plagueis and offer to make him an apprentice until Plagueis was at least a young man. Technically, if a Sith were to train their apprentice from youth, the master could spend most of the apprentice's youth traumatizing them and teaching them pain and suffering early. something that has also been done before, as one of the only Sith that we know of who has trained their apprentice since early childhood was Darth Sidious, who took Maul from Mother Talzin. Doing so because he was aware of Mother Talzin's massive power in the dark side, making Maul quite potent. With that said, Sidious did not really teach Maul until he was in his teenage years. So the core reason as to why the Sith wait to train their apprentices is so that the apprentice in question has already had a heavy hand of pain and trauma dealt to them. The exact opposite reason why the Jedi train so early. The Jedi want to avoid their younglings having a past, whereas the Sith want them to embrace it. Many Sith were former Jedi that were disgraced from the Order, or scorned for one reason or another. Other Dark Lords have embraced the dark side because their family was murdered, or their planet suffered genocide. If we look at Darth Zana, she crash-landed on a planet and was presumably the only survivor. She made friends with a forest creature who took care of her, but then it was killed in front of her by Republic soldiers. This enraged the young girl, who used the dark side to murder these two soldiers, and then was located and taken in by Darth Bane. Hundreds of years later, the Emperor would use former Jedi as inquisitors rather than raise dark Jedi from childhood. Their life and failures fuel their pain and rage, from which they draw from the wellspring of the dark side. One of the major difficulties with the Master just raising and traumatizing a Sith youth is that the youth's hatred will be directed at the Master rather than at the Jedi or other enemies. It's likely the Sith apprentice will try to kill the Master long before the correct time to do so, and therefore jeopardize the rule of two in the Sith Empire. But with that said, there is another major problem of the Sith raising their apprentices at a young age. The problem with raising a child apprentice is that their attachment will be to the Master. The Sith know that children have the natural tendency to latch on to whatever adult figure raises them, and will idolize that figure as their parent, regardless of how cruel the Master is. What results is the apprentice having an inability to grasp the concept of surpassing their Master and taking their place. This attachment makes the apprentice weak. Darth Bane experienced this issue firsthand with Zana because he had found her as such a young child and basically raised her. It didn't matter that he didn't show her any love or affection. He was still technically like her father. And because of this, Zana became complacent as an apprentice, and Bane began to worry eventually that she would not be able to overthrow him. With Bane being correct, as Zana didn't even think to overthrow her master until Bane began looking for another apprentice, the much older Darth Cognis. Sidious seemed to have learned this lesson from Bane, as though he took Maul as a young child. He never actually directly raised him. Rather, Sidious had Maul whisked away to a secret facility and raised by droids, with Sidious only visiting occasionally to check on his progress and establish himself as Maul's master. If we want to go even further, we might say that despite all this, Sidious still had the same problem, but of course, this time it was intentional. Prior to his dismemberment, Maul was fiercely loyal to Sidious and aimed only to please him. All of this goes to say that Maul was comfortable in Sidious's shadow until he was brought back by Mother Talzin and given his freedom from his tormentor. Sith choose older apprentices because their abilities have manifested. They've already had painful experiences that can be used, and they'll have the proper ambition to assume the role of master when the time comes. But anyway, my friends and acolytes, what are your thoughts on this, and your thoughts on this aspect of Star Wars lore and Sith culture? As always, my friends, may the Force be with you, and have a great day.